We need to identify the assumption in the reasoning here. Remember, an assumption is a statement that strengthens the argument and is something that must be true for the argument to hold. The conclusion is that it can be theorized that achieving a high GDP is necessary for enacting high per capita expenditure. That countries with high GDP are more likely does not lead to suggesting that this is necessary. This key term necessary is important here. A does not qualify as a valid assumption here. Answer choice B delves into comparison of the effects of low GDP versus the effects of a low per capita expenditure. This answer choice does nothing to relate to the necessary nature of a high GDP for a high per capita expenditure claimed in the argument. Answer choice B is not going to have any bearing on the argument. Answer choice D delves into one way of increasing the GDP not being as effective as another way of increasing the GDP. The argument is not about how the GDP should be increased. The argument is about a high GDP being a necessary condition for high per capita expenditure. Answer choice D is not going to have any bearing on the argument. Answer choice E is a trap. The claim is that high GDP is a necessity for a high per capita expenditure. The claim is not that high GDP is sufficient for a high per capita expenditure. So the argument does not consider high GDP as a sufficient condition for a high per capita expenditure. This is not an assumption. The assumption is that the argument considers high GDP as a necessary condition for a high per capita expenditure. Let's confirm answer choice C now. Answer choice C raises a very interesting concern. A higher per capita expenditure is not a precondition for a higher GDP. A very interesting thought. See, for this conclusion to hold, it is important to establish that high GDP does not necessarily require high per capita expenditure. Otherwise, this argument may run the risk of confusing cause with effect. This argument is considering high GDP as the cause and high per capita expenditure as the effect. And therefore, yes, it is assuming that it is not the other way around. It is not that a higher per capita expenditure is the cause for a higher GDP. Therefore, yes, answer choice C is something that strengthens the argument. It is something that must be true for the argument to hold. C is the correct answer choice.